Imagine a war that spanned 4 entire decades, completely reshaped the globe, and pushed humanity to the absolute brink of nuclear annihilation. But here's the crazy part. All of this happened without the two primary antagonists ever directly firing a single bullet at one another on a battlefield. It sounds impossible, right? Well, this is the incredible paradox of the geopolitical chess match we know as the Cold War. Stretching from 1947 right up until the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, it was an era defined by just this intense, unrelenting rivalry between the United States and the USSR. And as we're going to see, it left a legacy that is absolutely still shaping our world today.
We've got some fascinating ground to cover in this explainer. We're going to break this down into 5 easy-to-follow phases. First, defining the Cold War. Second, the Iron Curtain descends. Third, the economic battleground. Fourth, spies and secret wars. And finally, the Berlin Blockade.
Okay, let's dive right into part 1, defining the Cold War and the paradox of a bloodless conflict.
To really grasp what was happening in the late 20th century, we first need to define the actual mechanics of this era. I mean, what exactly makes a war cold? Well, the Cold War was a state of intense geopolitical tension between the US and the USSR. But the defining characteristic, the thing you have to remember, is that these two superpowers never fired a weapon directly at one another. Instead, they fought for ideological and economic dominance through other means. We're talking regional proxy wars, massive arms races in both conventional and nuclear weapons, the space race, and some seriously highly sophisticated espionage networks.
Now, you might be wondering where the name even comes from. Interestingly, the term itself wasn't coined by a politician or some 4-star general. It was actually coined by the famous writer George Orwell. In his 1945 essay, You and the Atomic Bomb, Orwell predicted a polarized world living constantly under the shadow of nuclear warfare. He foresaw a worldview and social structure that would prevail in a state that was, as he put it, unconquerable, yet locked in a permanent Cold War with its neighbors. It was a brilliantly chilling, and honestly entirely accurate prediction of the decades that were about to unfold.
Let's move on to part 2, the Iron Curtain descends, setting the board.
With our terms defined, let's shift to how the geopolitical board was actually set. In the immediate aftermath of World War II, the Grand Alliance that had just defeated the Axis powers rapidly began to fracture. And this brilliantly illustrates that fundamental divide. On one side, we have the United States and its allies forming the capitalist Western Bloc, which would eventually formalize its military alliance as NATO in 1949. And then, on the opposing side, you have the Soviet Union and its satellite states forming the communist Eastern Bloc, which would later match the West by forming the Warsaw Pact in 1955. It's really a perfect snapshot of a bipolar world taking shape.
And look, this division didn't just happen overnight, but man, it happened with alarming speed. Just look at this rapid-fire succession of early escalations. In 1946, former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill delivered a speech declaring that an Iron Curtain had descended across Europe. Literally just 1 year later, the Truman Doctrine was announced, and by 1948, a communist coup d'etat in Czechoslovakia completely shocked Western powers by pulling the country firmly into the Soviet orbit. You can literally visualize the shrinking of time between these global crises as tensions mounted.
All right, part 3, the economic battleground, dollars and subsidies.
As the political rhetoric heated up, the conflict quickly moved beyond just words and straight into the realm of economic maneuvering. Both superpowers realized that to secure their spheres of influence, they needed to rebuild them. This economic front was formalized by the Truman Doctrine in 1947. Sparked by a civil war in Greece, President Harry S. Truman championed a bipartisan U.S. policy of containment. The core goal here was to stop the spread of communism by supporting nations resisting it. And this began in earnest with a massive allocation of $400 million in aid to Greece and Turkey. That move established deterrence and economic support as the absolute foundational pillars of American foreign policy.
So both sides actively used economic aid as a strategic tool to win loyalty. The U.S. launched the Marshall Plan in 1948, pouring over $13 billion, which was a staggering amount of money back then, into rebuilding the democratic and economic systems of Western Europe. In response, Joseph Stalin was fearful that Western economic integration would pull Eastern European nations right out of his control, so he actually prevented his satellite states from accepting the American aid. Instead, the Soviet Union countered with the Molotov Plan, which was later institutionalized as Comecon. This utilized Soviet subsidies and trade to integrate Central and Eastern Europe into their very own distinct economic bloc.
Okay, this brings us to a really fascinating question. I want you to think about this for a second. When direct military confrontation means potential nuclear annihilation, how do you fight an enemy you literally cannot attack? Where does the battle go?
Let's find out in Part 4, Spies and Secret Wars, The Shadow Game.
The answer is that the battle goes directly into the shadows. It becomes this high-stakes game of espionage, injecting a literal spy thriller level of intrigue into international relations. Now, what's really interesting about this is looking at the specific tactics. You have the Soviet KGB handling foreign espionage, widespread internal surveillance, and what they called active measures, which basically included calculated disinformation and forgeries to further Soviet goals. On the other side, the US CIA focused heavily on counterintelligence, covertly sponsoring propaganda campaigns like the Crusade for Freedom and meticulously debriefing defectors from the Eastern Bloc. But perhaps the most shocking revelation of this entire shadow war was the existence of atomic spies. These were Soviet infiltrators deep inside the top-secret US Manhattan Project. This incredible breach of security allowed the USSR to detonate its first nuclear weapon in 1949, which was years sooner than the West anticipated.
However, it wasn't just a one-sided game. The United States had its own distinct advantages, primarily in signals intelligence. Enter the Venona Project. This was a highly classified U.S. operation that successfully procured and analyzed coded foreign messages, effectively monitoring those exact Soviet spy networks operating in America. It provided overwhelming proof of espionage activities. Yet, and this is the ultimate twist of spycraft, this massive American decryption advantage was actually betrayed to the USSR by double agents like Kim Philby. So basically both sides were constantly reading each other's mail while simultaneously trying to hide the fact that they were doing so. It's just wild.
Finally, we reach Part 5, the Berlin Blockade, the first physical standoff.
So all of this ideological tension, the economic maneuvering, the covert spying, it eventually had to manifest physically. And this brings us right to the climax of our explainer, the Berlin Blockade. This event serves as a brilliant micro-study of the entire Cold War dynamic, all centered on a single, divided city. Let's move to the steps and see how this builds, following a classic chain of action and reaction. Following World War II, Germany and its capital, Berlin, were divided into occupation zones. Step 1. The US and Britain merged their Western German occupation zones into what was called the Buy Zone to begin economic rebuilding. Step 2. The West introduces a new, stable currency, the Deutschmark, to replace the debased old currency. Step 3. Viewing this as a direct threat, Stalin reacts aggressively. In June 1948, he institutes the Berlin Blockade, completely cutting off all land and water access to prevent Western supplies from reaching the enclave of West Berlin.
The response to this blockade was absolutely unprecedented. Instead of forcing their way through on the ground, which, risks starting World War III, the US, Britain, France, and their allies launched the Berlin airlift. This became a massive, coordinated logistical supply chain right in the air, delivering provisions around the clock. And it included wonderfully humanizing details. Take U.S. Air Force pilot Gail Halvorsen, for instance. He initiated Operation Vittles, becoming famous as the Candy Bomber for literally dropping sweets to German children from his plane. The airlift was such an undeniable logistical and psychological success that Stalin was eventually forced to back down and lift the blockade in May 1949.
But while the blockade ended, the damage to East-West relations was permanent. This early logistical standoff solidified a divided world. By late 1949, Germany was formally and completely split into the Federal Republic of Germany in the west and the Soviet-controlled German Democratic Republic in the east. The literal, physical borders of the Cold War had been drawn, establishing lines that would remain frozen for decades to come.
So the crucial point we need to take away from all this is this. The Cold War may have avoided traditional battlefield combat between its two main players, but its proxy conflicts, economic systems, and covert operations fundamentally rewired the globe, which leaves us with one final provocative thought to consider. If the Cold War officially ended with the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, why do the geopolitical divisions, the military alliances, and the lingering mistrust it created still echo so loudly in international relations today? It's a big question. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I hope this gives you a whole new lens to view modern geopolitics.